Bienvenidos a un capítulo más de Diálogos Sensoriales. Seguimos con la modalidad itinerante y ahora tengo el enorme placer de platicar con una de las personas que, aunque no lo crean, influyó mucho en la historia sensorial y en lo particular también al conocerlo fue muy interesante su punto de vista sensorial. Chris Finlay es una persona muy reconocida en el área sensorial y estudios con consumidor por su gran contribución al área, siempre comprometido con la difusión y aplicar la ciencia sensorial de la mejor forma. Ha tenido muchas publicaciones como autor y coautor de metodologías nuevas, calibración de panel, desarrollo de métodos afectivos, miembro activo del IFT, Pangborn, mentor de muchos estudiantes, tanto en Canadá, y bueno, fundador de la compañía Compusense al final de los años 80, y bueno, ahí contribuyó muchísimo al área hasta finales de 2021, en agosto, donde decide dejar de ser CEO y funda la compañía C-K Findlay Consultants, en la cual sigue contribuyendo su aportación al área sensorial. Chris, thank you very much for accepting this invitation to talk with me. I'm really sure that people will enjoy this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ivan. It really is a pleasure, and I have never found any great difficulty in speaking. So I will be pleased to answer your questions and perhaps to take some side routes that might cast some light on how I got to where I am right now. And I will respond to your questions, and you can direct this conversation.
No, it's fine. It's as you know, it's something that most of the people are interested in. I have been with my colleagues and trying to figure out which questions can we ask to the people who influence sensory in any aspect. And of course, your name arises, and we want to know why sensory. Why you start doing sensory?
The question is absolutely perfect. One reason, of course, is it's very deep. So my undergraduate degree was in chemistry, and I worked in vegetable proteins. So I worked in vegetable proteins almost 50 years ago. And we were in the same place then that we are now, except now we have more of a market. But one of the things that interested me was meat flavor, and how could soy sauce provide us with something like meat flavor? And it was through the hydrolysis of the proteins that you're able to produce, well, obviously hydrolysates, but they have a meat-like flavor. And this is something that had been well known for a long time. But of course, we had gas chromatography and mass spectroscopy to work with. So I was trying to find out what the components were of meat flavor. And I worked for an excellent Canadian company that had terrific resources. And I put together all of the ingredients, and it tasted like kerosene. It was awful. So clearly, it was missing something. Right. And that to me was what triggered me to look into flavors. I worked in pharmaceuticals as well. And excuse me, in pharmaceutical product development, the interest is in trying to make things that are nasty taste acceptable. And that was not about a hedonic response. It was about trying to make something, more palatable. So I got exposed to flavors, and I got exposed to textures and aromas. And what I realized was those are the things that drive people's desire for products. It's not the chemistry, it's not the nutritional composition, it's not how much protein or fat are in a piece of meat that makes you interested. It's the flavor, it's the texture. So when I started working with vegetable proteins, I became very interested in trying to emulate the texture, imitate the texture of meat. And of course, you can't really imitate something unless you understand it. And this was what drove me back to school. So I went back to the University of Guelph to do my master's and PhD in food science. My master's degree was done on scallops, the seafood.
Yeah.
And that little muscle, that little white muscle, is absolutely perfect. It's got almost no connective tissue. It has almost no fat. The muscle fibers run end to end, and it is perfect in every way. In fact, during the French period of aestheticism, it was chosen to be the superlative food. If you had to eat, then it would be to eat the scallop. So it was a lovely model system to work with, and I did microscopy, and I did textural analysis, and I presented results at a conference in Winnipeg, and a very predominant at that time Professor Marvin Tung, who was a food engineer, said, well, this is all interesting, but how do people feel about it? And I said to myself, oh my God, this is food. If we can't make people happy, then what are we doing?
Right.
So I took the learnings from that and I applied them into my PhD. And my PhD was on the thermomechanical properties of beef. So I still know far too much about what happens at the molecular level to the proteins and the structure of beef, and what contributes to rare, medium, and well done. So I did, again, the electron microscopy, I did the instrumental texture work, I did differential scanning calorimetry, so I did very high-tech approaches, but I anchored it in a panel. So that was the first panel that I actually trained, and it was to be able to measure the changes that had been taking place during the cooking of meat. My PhD supervisor said, I don't believe in sensory. But I insisted on getting Elizabeth Gillette on my committee, and Elizabeth was really an expert in sensory, but also in meat texture. And she was very formative in terms of supporting me in that. And although she had gone to the University of Massachusetts at the same time that my PhD supervisor was there, they were not friends at all. And my supervisor referred to sensory data as junk. And the problem was not that the data was junk, that it was the methods that were being used to collect that data were poor. And I told him at the time, if you did liquid chromatography in the same way that you do sensory, your results would be junk as well. So it was what really drove me to look into sensory and to start to concentrate on how sensory can be used to drive product development. So the thing that I realized, because I became a director of research for a company when I graduated, was that the amount of time that was taken to get the results back on sensory was too long. It was too long for a reasonable loop in product development. And I was very fortunate because in the early 1980s, I was a rapid adopter of microcomputers. So I became very interested in computing, and I realized that we could collect the data that way. And this is, of course, where Compusense came from. But it was meant as a means to an end. And the end was to have better data faster that could be used to direct product development. It also came as a major realization to me that there was a fundamental split in sensory between the sensory that is hedonic, which is all about consumers, and the sensory which is analytic, which is all about sensory properties. And for the last 40 years, I have been trying to convince the world that sensory properties are as real as every other property of matter. So that if you can measure these properties well, they are entirely dependable. It's not something that's simply subjective. But that was a hard sell. And
I know.
many of the companies that I dealt with had made major investments in sensory methods. And I don't need to mention the individual descriptive methods, but there was a large commitment. Sensory was also being driven at that time to a large extent by people who were product experts. So they were the sommelier, they were the winemakers, the brewmasters, the cheesemakers, the golden tongues that had the opinion and had the backing of management, because it was not about whether they were reliable, it was that they were part of the process. And sensory was being driven at that time very much by process. So the interest was, you know, what do you change in a process that actually has an impact on the sensory properties, and how can you manage that? Anyway,
yeah,
where am I going to go with this? So I'm going to go 2 steps further, and then you can ask me a question.
No problem.
So when I started Compusense, it was strictly as an IT company, but it was very clear that we needed to have a test location to be able to work with the software and to go through software development. So I had a nice relationship with the University of Guelph, and we used the lab there. But it was very clear that there were limitations around that. If you work with universities, you know that universities have to be limited because they're public institutions and they're primarily there for teaching and research. So that was when I started the sensory part of the company, and it was based upon a relationship that I'd had with a major Canadian brewer. And for 3 years, we had the contract to do all of their beer sensory. So this was a great foundation to be able to start working on sensory. But what I realized when I came to attempt to recruit people was I couldn't find decent graduates who had strong sensory background. So this is when I started teaching. And I started teaching sensory evaluation at the Department of Food Science at the University of Guelph as an evening course. So the students would come for 1 night of lecture, and then they would come for either a morning or an afternoon lab at Compusense. And I was so fortunate because at that time, the sensory evaluation text by Harry Lawless and Hildegard Heyman had been released. And knowing Harry and Hildegard made all the difference, because I invited them to my class as guest speakers, and they were wonderful. And I would have to say that they shaped me enormously. And I hope I had some influence in return. So that's what got me to be a professor. There you go.
Wow. I now I understand why you are very well connected between the academia and research and let's say industry. It's interesting that the history. I mean, normally people who works in companies, they don't like to do research, most of the people, but you know the benefits of that. So based on that, how easy it was for you to connect with more universities who didn't do sensory at that time, and then spread the word more, let's faster in some way. Was that something that was difficult or not?
So I scratch my head and say, was it difficult? I think fundamentally, I recognized how important it was to create relationships, to develop relationships in the food industry and also in the scientific societies. So I became very active in the Canadian Institute of Food Science and Technology even before I went back to school. So that way I got, I mean, in fact, I was the director responsible for education. So I had connections with all the Canadian universities and got to know them quite well. And of course, I was very actively involved in the local sections, but also in the meetings. And then I got involved with IFT in 1974. And of course, I'm still involved with IFT all these years later. But the advantage in having those relationships was really extremely important, because it meant that I could make the connection between industry, who wanted the technology, and academia, who wanted to be able to connect with industry, because it's still a problem for. There's always going to be a tension between industry and academia, because industry wants to keep secrets. And some of the secrets that they want to keep are not secrets. They just don't know that they're not secrets. And then the academics would like to have funding, but they don't want to be necessarily held responsible or accountable. And there's always suspicion that when a project is done in an academic environment, it's very difficult to maintain secrecy around it. Yes. So it's great fun. Very fortunately, in the food area, the relationship between industry and academia is very strong. It's impossible to run a major food manufacturing operation without engineering. And the engineers, and in fact, most countries in the world that produce food scientists actually produce food engineers. And this is not well understood in America or even in Canada. But much of the rest of the world, the focus is on engineering, because it's about the transformation from raw materials into food. But to be food, it has to not only be safe, it has to be palatable. It doesn't matter if there are no bacteria. If the texture is awful and it smells bad, then it's not food. Right. Anyway. Oh yeah.
What's the main difference? I know it's some tricky in this case, but doing sensory in the 80s, let's say the time you start doing more or faster the sensory, and nowadays, what's the main difference on the goal of sensory, if there is a difference?
I'm not sure that the goal is different, Ivan. I would observe that, yeah. So in making that move from paper to the computer, it was not just getting rid of paper. It was enabling a different way of capturing data, as you know. And along with that became the transformation of the data, because once you've got it captured, you can now start to apply some pretty high-level mathematical techniques. So when I was first involved in teaching sensory, it was not unusual to have a sensory lab for students to do analysis of variance manually. And if you've ever done ANOVA manually, it's awful. It's a lot of work, and it doesn't give you very much. So now we see that we don't even press a button. It all happens automatically as part of the process. Right. But it opened the door at the same time to multivariate statistics. And of course, as you know, with Phys, PCA became an integral part. Back in the day of Peter Punter, with PSA, it allowed generalized procrustes analysis to be run immediately. These are powerful techniques that are extremely important in terms of visualization. And I think if there's a fundamental change that I've seen in the last 30 years, last 20 years, it is moving from data to storytelling. And when you tell a story, it helps to have pictures. So if you have the images, then they can help in telling the story. And this is, I think, a pretty major change. So if there's any advice that I give, young people going into sensory, it is learn how to use the tools of multivariate analysis and higher level statistics, and use them correctly. But they are powerful.
Yes, it's important, that part, because when I start doing sensory, not so long, but the last century, but I did ANOVA by hand. But I start doing ANOVA also by a computer program, and I was like reevaluated. I wasn't the same doing data capture by hand or collecting data by a software, and I was like enthusiastic again. I was like, okay, I can do my analysis rather than spend most of the time doing manual capture. If you put that the storytelling, people who can handle that software, but understand the statistics, of course, they can tell a story well performed and well structured, and that's something that can have benefits to the science or to the sensory science. I totally agree. I mean, it's interesting that part.
Well, it's really funny, Van. The Sensometrics conference that we held at Brock University in Niagara, there was a session that Anne Hasted and I ran, which was essentially statistics for dummies, how to communicate statistical outcomes to non-statisticians. And our expectation was that we would have maybe a dozen people who were non-statisticians come. But instead, we ended up with 60 people, of which most of them were statisticians. And one of the reasons that the statisticians were there was that they were greatly concerned that they were not effectively communicating their outcomes. Because it doesn't matter if you're right. If you can't get people to believe or to understand it, then it's worthless. And that's the thing that's important.
Right. Also, I remember a session on sensometric in Davis, where people start comparing PLS and preference mapping, clustering. But at the end, Peter Ponter said, okay, none of those techniques gives more information rather than this table of means. That was very amazing, because it's okay. It doesn't matter. You have many tools, but you can be as simple as practice. I mean, I was amazed in that part.
Well, I think that I learned lessons very early on about both PCA and GPA, that they can create interesting pictures that we will create stories to explain. But if the proportion of variance being explained is very low, then it's entirely fiction. So we might as well just make up a good story. And Peter was very good at that. He not just at making up stories. He was very good at using the tools, because anytime we would do an interpretation of a GPA, we would always have the table of the data so that we could understand what was going on. And I mean, you've done this type of thing yourself, I'm sure, in working with clients. And sometimes it's difficult to explain. But it can be that the third or the fourth principal component is where the important information is. And that you have trivial information that's big, that's up front. But what really differentiates your product can be right down in the weeds, as we say. But you have to have experience to do that. And we always talk about, at the end of a descriptive analysis, what are the things that you do? And then finally, it is interpretation, because you have to have some understanding of the product. I think the wonderful thing about Sensory too is that people who are really committed to Sensory own their product. They understand the product. And one of the disabilities that our statisticians have is that they view everything in the form of data. And I know that when we work with our clients, we have to take that and put it into a product form so that they can actually see it. And I know one of my most successful debriefs with a client was with bread. And this was a case where, and I've publicized this, so this is not secret, but we did about 16 different types of whole grain breads and created a very nice PCA, which had all the data on it, meant nothing, put names on it, the names were there. Instead, put images on, so images of each of the breads. And then when we actually did the debrief of the client, I had a PCA made that was 1 meter by 2 meters. We put it on the floor and we put the products on the map. And the marketing people were just so happy because they could see where and why products were where they were on the map. So, if you have the data, but you cannot put it into an actionable form, it's going to be a liability.
Right. What's your opinion about that? Sensory is easy, and I can learn sensory in 1 year, for example, or 6 months, and then I can be an expert. Is that possible? I know it depends on the skills of everybody, but what's your opinion about that? It's really possible that or not so possible?
Oh, Ethan, that is so dangerous. And it was one of the things that scared me when I taught sensory, because I would teach what amounted to 40 class hours and 10 labs and a major project. And I would have graduates from the food science department going and managing sensory labs. And it's just ridiculous. Experience is extremely important, and the absence of experience is very dangerous. On top of that, and putting it the other way around, I think there are many people in sensory who have learned experientially. So they have come into the sensory lab because they happen to be available, and they become over time turned into sensory scientists. And I think that there's great legitimacy in that as well. But it's like going to, well, I mean, when I had my eye surgery done, when I had laser eye surgery in the year 2000, and the man that did it had already done 5,000 surgeries. So I had confidence that he actually knew what he was doing. And now, 23 years later, my eyes are still perfect. So.
No, I know, because I have speak with people that they don't do sensory, but they want to implement sensory, and they ask me all the time, okay, how fast is that? In next month I will be able to do that, or stuff like that. And it's
so one of the things that I do is I teach a client how to do a specific task, and it's usually a difference from control model. But I simplify it, but I make sure that the sensory order of operations is followed. So if you're going to work with attributes, every attribute has to be clearly defined, and there has to be a clear example of that attribute. And if people are not in agreement and have clear understanding of the attribute, then they're random number generators. They don't provide useful information. In fact, they can be a nuisance.
right.
So that's number one.
Yeah, that, I agree. What about, well, you already mentioned some of them, but do you have present that moment when you did your first sensory project or achievement, when at that time you said, this is what I love to do. I love sensory from now. I don't want to do something else other than sensory. Do you have that time in your mind, or not?
Not a specific moment, no. I was very fortunate. Before I went back to school, I worked for a very large supermarket firm, and I was manager of R&D. And we had about 1,500 products. We had the largest single bakery in North America. We made over 700 products in the bakery. We had a very large deli frozen food area where I spent 3 years on frozen pizza and still liked pizza. So being exposed to so many products and seeing the differentiation of the products was really important to me. A realization, though, was that I found that there were people in the population, probably still about 40% of the population, that are essentially non-discriminators. They really don't care. They have nothing that drives them about a product. Yet, I found from an early age that there were products that I really liked and products that I really disliked. And that's okay. It was the same thing with my children. I have a daughter who is a super taster and a son who is a non-taster. And they both grew up being, I'm talking from the standpoint, of course, of prop and the so-called super taster test. But you know, they are in their 40s now, and they enjoy a full range of foods, and they like what they, well, in fact, it's my youngest grandson that says, I like what I like.
Wow.
And that's what's really important.
Yeah.
And some people are super sensitive, and that's an amazing thing, but it's also a liability. So in the area of beverage alcohol, musty, corked in wine is a real major problem, and it's usually associated with trichloroanisole or trichlorobromine. So TCA in the general population has a threshold of about 2 or 3 parts per billion. So one of the managers at the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, and they test about 25,000 different wines a year, can detect TCA reliably to a part per trillion. And there are people who do not detect until a part per million. So you can have two people side by side, one saying, this is disgusting, and the other one saying, I don't get it. And it's perfectly legitimate. And that's one of the major discoveries to me, is just how different we are from a sensory standpoint. And I think being able to appreciate that really helps us understand consumers.
Yes, interesting. Okay, Chris, there's well, at this time of the interview, I will ask you some pair testing. So you need to answer which of the options you prefer, select. And I will start with red wine or white wine.
Red wine without any question. The white wines that I really like are very expensive.
Wow. You can make some suggestion for people who works in wine, so they can spread the word and maybe lower the prices. Who knows? Tetra testing or triangle test?
I think that the tetrad is more powerful. Triangle is in some ways a simpler test, and it has a lot of tradition, so it's well accepted. And I think that there is a lot of emphasis put on difference testing, and I think there are places where difference testing is applied where the difference is already obvious, so it's only being done pro forma. And there's the possibility on the other extreme of being able to detect differences that are so small that they're irrelevant. And one of the examples I give is, if you look at a basket of apples, and they've all come from the same tree, we can differentiate them. They can all be viewed as being different, yet we are prepared to accept them as being equivalent. And I think that common sense has to be used in terms of the methodologies that are being used. Doing a triangle test with only 6 respondents is irresponsible. And there was a nice PhD student on whose committee I served a number of years ago, who wanted to follow the oxidation of white wine using a triangle test with 6 respondents. And I said, no.
No,
not at all. Stick to the chemistry, otherwise you're wasting your time.
right.
And he thanked me a lot. It saved him a lot of work, and it wouldn't have given any decent information.
Yes. City or forest?
So my story is very simple on this one. It depends. So it depends is the Gail Van Seville answer to most questions. So I had the very fortune of coming to Canada as a young child from Scotland and being exposed to the wonders of the wilderness of Canada. So when I was first in university, I worked in geology, and I had a summer job where I worked in the north doing field work, which meant that I was in canoes on lakes, flying in small planes from lake to lake, working in 2-man teams. I was very popular because I knew how to cook. important when you're in the bush. And what I discovered was that that the woods are full of biting insects and bad food. So for me, for a career, it did not seem to be a good idea. But I still very much enjoy the outdoors, and we canoe and we glamorously camp. We don't rough it. I love cities, but I love visiting cities. So cities to me are extremely walkable, and I was just back again in Edinburgh, which was really essentially where I came from in Scotland. And Edinburgh is such a wonderful walkable city. You were there for Pangborn. I think you were there.
No, not in that case. Not at all.
Oh, damn. So there were a lot of sensory people that made it to Edinburgh, and it's just marvelous how much culture there is, the food and everything involved with that. But at the same time, I get tired of cities with too many people, and so I live in Guelph, which is a city of about 150,000. But I live in the old part, so it's the town within the city. Everything is walkable, and Toronto's only an hour away. So,
okay.
So there's a qualified answer.
Yeah. Traditional descriptive analysis or rapid methods?
So definitely traditional descriptive analysis if you're looking for the sensory properties and trying to create a gold standard. Rapid sensory methods are useful, like any rapid method. If you need a quick answer, it will give you a quick answer. Unfortunately, most rapid methods are not repeatable. And so we can argue about making them more repeatable, and you make them more repeatable by training and by doing more reps,
spending more time.
Exactly, any of the advantage you might get, you can lose. So it's a matter of using the right tool, and I think that we have to approach the tools that we have in sensory in the same way that we do any tool. You need the right tool for the job.
Right. Breakfast or dinner?
So I'm a great fan of dinner, but I also like a brunch. So I don't like early morning breakfast. I like a breakfast probably between 10 and 11 o'clock. And those breakfasts, see, I remember being in Montevideo, going to the Mercado, the old port, and having parrillada for breakfast.
Wow. That was huge.
Dinner? Yes, absolutely. I am pluralistic in terms of the styles of cuisine that I like, and I enjoy dinner a lot.
Right, it's better. You can mix it with wine and other stuff. Not necessarily the breakfast. Why not? Yeah. Okay.
There's some temptations around breakfast.
Right, yeah. Analytical testing or consumer testing?
Oh, you're asking awful questions, Ivan. Because,
I know.
Because it's like oh no, I won't go there. So the answer is yes.
I know.
I love consumers, and I love doing consumer testing. So one of the things that I learned when I started doing testing on scallops was, and this was when I was still doing my master's, was that I put together a panel to evaluate a scallop analog that I had received from Japan. Very nice looking scallops. And I found no significant difference between the natural scallops and the analog. And I said, no, this is impossible. I can see the difference. There's a huge difference here. So I went back and I spoke to my panelists, my consumers, and I found that those consumers that had normally eaten scallops selected scallops and rejected the analog, and those that never ate scallops liked the analog, because the analog was perfectly perfectly uniform. It was entirely bland. So the important thing with consumers is understanding the question you're asking and connecting with consumers. Analytical, I will continue to teach descriptive analysis and feedback calibration as the method for getting the best performance out of your panel, and treating descriptive analysis in the same way that I would treat quantitative chemical analysis.
Yeah. I know that those are terrible questions. I know, but it's interesting to know the preferences in general for people who do sensory. PDF or published books?
I've switched over to electronic ages ago. I still like books. There's no question, and I still have my favorite books. But from the standpoint of capability, I have my iPad with me. I have half of the world's library on my iPad. I mean, it's just beyond belief.
Right. Preference mapping or PLS?
Ooh, wow. Yeah, external preference mapping.
Right. And finally, parametric or non-parametric statistics?
Yes. I mean, to me, it's interesting because the choice is actually made by the method that you choose in the first place.
Right.
So if you choose a parametric method, then you can use parametric statistics. So I think the wise choice is either speak to a statistician or do enough in the way of statistical learning that you understand what it is you're doing in the first place. It was funny, even as recently as maybe 10 years ago, I would have customers call me and say, Dr. Findlay, my p-value is 0.04. Is that good or bad? And I would have to say, if you're asking the question, then you don't know what you're doing.
Right. That happens a lot. Okay. Thanks for your answers. We're almost done with the interview, but what is your opinion about doing artificial intelligence with sensory? Is that the future? It worth it? No, it's not possible. But what do you think in this case?
So I've actually dealt with this question a number of times, and I've given a couple of presentations on it, although the last one was probably about 3 years ago. And it really is that artificial intelligence is a misnomer. So we're talking about using mathematical techniques to be able to interpret data. And the methods of manipulation through artificial intelligence can either be instructed, we can tell it what to do, or we can allow it to discover what to do. So allowing discovery requires vast quantities of data. And we have vast quantities of data in population data that can be really interesting. And it can provide, again, output that could be, like possibly be, true or interesting. But if you shrink that data down, then you end up with a problem in terms of the confidence that you can have in the outcome. And I think that that's really the question that we have. But there are a number of things that artificial intelligence can do for us in sensory that would make our lives easier. So artificial intelligence can be applied to help us design experiments. And I know how complicated it was to come up with incomplete block designs that had full balance. And we were able to do that, certainly now 30 years ago. but now it's being done quite routinely. But we can also use artificial intelligence to create experiments that have other criteria built in. So we can use artificial intelligence perhaps to do a better job of recruiting the consumers that we need to be able to actually evaluate a product. So the biggest concern that I've had about consumers is that we know a whole series about consumers. There's no average consumer. There's no universal product, and that consumers lie. And we are all consumers, and we all lie. And it's not because we really think we're lying. We think we're telling the truth. And that's the thing that's really scary. I don't know, Yvonne, how many times in consumer experiments you've asked people what they normally buy. And there was one experiment that we did where we had 3 products. One was entirely fictitious, never ever been on the market. 15% of our consumers said they bought it regularly.
Yeah. We have one study that we asked, what about the cheese flavor? And the product didn't have any cheese, and they loved the cheese.
So, I mean, that's the point. So you can't really overcome this with artificial intelligence. But the applications of machine learning are really very useful. And I think that, computerization itself is extremely handy. So in the research that we did on sensory-informed design, one of the areas there was filling in the missing data points in that. And the work that John Castura and I did with Paul McNicholas and his colleagues were around being able to impute what a probable data point would look like, and then to be able to refine that point through iteration. And the models are very clever, and they actually work. But the question is always going to be, how much confidence do you have in it? And when you're dealing with marketing people would like to be able to say 60% of consumers, not 6% of consumers. So they want to be able to say that the data has come from a very large consumer population, and that doesn't necessarily make it true.
Right. Yeah. Is there any basic skills or something related to methodology, statistics that sensory scientists must have during their starting in sensory field?
Oh, that's a great question, Yvonne. The thing that makes it a challenging question is that the thing that we all need is common sense. And the problem with common sense is you cannot explain it to somebody. Either they have it or they don't. So it's a very hard skill to teach. It's like teaching entrepreneurism. If you have to take a course in entrepreneurism, you're not an entrepreneur. Maybe you become a researcher of entrepreneurs.
Right.
So in terms of the skills that most people need, they need to have some understanding of logic. What is it that makes sense? Because that's the final tool that we use in interpretation. Hal McPhee introduced the term, to me anyway, of ecological validity. Does something make sense in society? He's probably not the originator of that term, but it really is. Does any of this make sense at the end? The other key really is about communication. And I think that being able to establish good communication with clients, with peers, is absolutely essential. We have a saying, there is a saying that's almost universal, and that is that it takes a village to raise a child. Right. Now it takes a team to be able to make new products. It takes a team to be able to run a company. And the only way teams work is through trust and through communication. And those are important soft skills. Almost all the hard skills can be learned. And if you're not good at it, find somebody who is. People very often made the assumption that I was a computer programmer. And I was never a programmer. I knew how to program in BASIC. I did some work in Fortran. I knew how computer programs worked. But as you well know, you should well know anyway, 95% of software right now is about user interface.
Right.
It's all about usability. It's not about crunching numbers. And that requires a lot of skill. So find a good programmer, someone that you can communicate with.
Right. Yes. So that came to teamwork. I mean, the people who wants to work with a team. I mean, you cannot work alone. You can do it, but it's better if you gather a group of people that handles different skills, which everybody, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And well, almost at the end. Do you have a particular document, PDF, or book that you can suggest to the people who were starting at sensory at this point, or maybe who is an advanced sensory researcher? Can you suggest something for them?
I was just going to pick it up and
Yeah.
The sensory evaluation by Lawless and Heyman. It's a wonderful text. I used it in teaching, and I did get some criticism from my students because I would say, okay, we're going to be covering discrimination. So this is the chapter you have to read before the lecture. And we have to read. It's really important to read it, and the fact is that and it's extremely well researched. It's not the only reference at all. Some of the other references are more biased, I would say, towards a specific technique, and some have become dated. Also, having contributed to many of the textbooks or many of the books that are out there now, I know that we have a snapshot in time of a particular interest, and the fact is it changes. I have 4 rules that I teach. The first is keep it simple. If you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, then you will not be able to explain it to a customer. The second is make it actionable. So if you're going to measure something, if you're going to ask a question, what are you going to do with the answer? Because if you don't know what you're going to do with the answer, then don't ask the question. Right. And then the third is make a decision when you communicate, whether you're trying to train, tell people how, or whether you're trying to educate, teaching people why. And then the fourth is always apply best practice, and be aware that best practice is always changing, is going to be evolving. So stay current.
Right. Yes, that's another issue that well, maybe we can do chapter 2, because I want to know about good practices of sensory, but it's almost done the time. So I have a final question, Chris. Let's say you have a time machine, and you can program it to go at the exact point you are starting doing sensory. What would you say to Chris at that time, if you have that time machine?
I would say buy stock in Coca-Cola. No, the advice that I would have is really about being persistent, and that's, if you're an innovator, if you are an inventor, if you're a researcher, you're an optimist. Be optimistic. If we start off by saying that we're going to fail, we will fail. It's if you give up too soon, but be persistent. But always remember to take good advice.
Right. system. That's something important. Chris, do you have any contact that you want to share with the people? Maybe they can reach you if they have a question or they want to get your services.
Well, I can always be found on LinkedIn, and you can certainly contact me at my consulting company. And my email address for that is Chris at C-K Findlay Consultants.
Great.
.com. It's a very, very long word, but that's where I can be found.
Thank you, Chris. I just by saying, I remember the first time. Well, I met you on a Yahoo groups when I sent an email by mistake, and you answered very polite because I wanted to sell something, and you answered very polite to my email. But the first time I saw you was during a conference at Dijon during Pangborn, and I was impressed by how you transmit the things, how you explain the stuff, and you make it easy. So it makes sense with the things you are now communicating. We keep it simple and thank you so much for accepting me this invitation. And I think people will enjoy it, and many people will be inspired by this conversation. Anything else you want to share with us?
Just muchas gracias.
Thank you, and hopefully we can meet at any conference, Pangborn conference next year, and we can exchange a beer if possible. Thank you, and a ustedes, muchas gracias por vernos. Si les gustó, denle like y compartan. Si no, bueno, pues no digan nada. Y suscríbanse a nuestro canal o en Spotify. Bye. See you. Thank you, Chris.
Adiós.
Bye.